So let me share my screen. Okay, so before we get started with our Recursion 2 topic for today, we're going to go over two problems from last night. So the first one is going to be const sum digits, okay? And sum digits, what sum digits is supposed to do is it takes in a number, and we have to return one number of all of those digits combined together, added together. So if we had a number of 111, it should be 3. If we had a number of 22, it should be 4. If we had a number of 57, it should be 12. Okay? So how do we do this, right? Well, I guess we can loop through the number and then take each individual digit and just add it to a sum. However, you cannot iterate through numbers. Numbers are they're non-iterable. You can't do that, right? So what if we can coerce it into something that is iterable? Huh? What if we made that number a string, right? So we can say let's numString equal to an empty string plus num. So now we have both our num and our numString, okay? And now we can say, well, since we know that we're doing recursion and we know we have to loop through this numString and kind of add it to our thing, right? So what we can do is we can say, like, since we have to loop through the string and we know we're using recursion and we know that it's being based off of a string, we know that we kind of have to reduce the length of that string, right? So our base case right away, it can be if numString dot length is going to be equal to 1, right? If there's only one thing in there, if there's only one thing that's left, we can just return the num, right? Because this is a little different, right? We're returning a num here, but we're checking the num string. It's because what we're going to be passing into our recursive case is going to still be a number. However, the way that we can get rid of one of those digits is to first make it a string, right? So right away, what we can do is we could say let sum equals 0, right? Because we know we have to add these things together. And we could do is sum plus equal number of numString of 0, right? So we have that thing, we have the first character now, and the first character of numString would be the first digit of the number, right? So if we turn that into a number, and then this would be shorthand plus numString of 0, then we can add that into our sum, okay? So what do we do now? We need to add the rest of them, right? But we need to do this recursively. So we have to call this function again, and we have to say sum plus equals sum digits, and what we pass in is the number, and then what we pass in would be numString dot slice of 1, right? And then we will go down and down. This function will run over and over again until we hit this, and then we just return a number, right? So when we hit that length of 1, what we will be returning to, we can also do this. We could also say 0 and return 0, right? But we'll just say when its length is 1 to save us one function call, right? Because, it's just one function call. It's faster. And then at the very end, we can just return sum. Okay? Any questions?
Yesterday, during a couple of the problems, I was like declaring sum or solution or result or whatever and setting it equal to 0. Then as the function would like loop through, I'm guessing it would continuously reset sum to 0. Is there like a specific place we should declare sum? Like is it wrong to do it on the first line of the function?
No, I'm pretty sure you can do this here. It should be a big deal, right? So like if we console.log some digits and pass in 111, right? We got 3. It's the same thing. So, but you are correct in when we're doing this recursively, right? For each of these things, sum is always going to be initialized at 0. However, in that function call, right, we start sum at 0. And then we add that first character to sum. So then after line 9, sum is 1, right? So then on line 10, we are adding to that 1 now. We're saying 1 plus equals some digits, and then we're going to pass in 11. So when we call some digits with 11, in that function call, sum is also initiated to 0, right? So then we do this thing, and then we take the first digit, which would be 1, and then we add it to sum. And then we say, in that case, well, sum is now going to be plus equal to some digits of slice off, right? Which is just the number 1. And now sum is 0 again. And now we say if numString.length is 1, which it is, because it's just the number 1, we return num. So we return that 1. So now, that whole time, in that call with some digits of 11, that whole time we were waiting for some digits of 1 to finish running to see what it returned, and it returned 1, right? So we do sum plus equals 1. So we do 1 plus equals 1, which is 2, right? And then we finally hit line 11 and we return sum, which is 2. And that whole time that some digits of 11 was running, some digits of 111 was waiting for that to finish, right? So to add it to that 1. And what does some digits of 11 return? It returns 2, right? So what we get would be 1 plus 2 is 3, and that's why we get 3. So every time recursively you're calling this function, sum is initiated to 0. However, that's fine. Like, if we were doing a for loop, we wouldn't declare the sum inside of the for loop, because every iteration of the loop, the sum would just reset itself to 0, right? However, this is a little different, because we can capture that value by returning sum at the very end and adding it here to itself. By doing that, we go down and down and down, and we, add on as we come back into our original function call.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I think I was just calling some digits again without adding it.
Yeah. So, okay. So like that's a problem, right? So let's say I didn't do this. What happens? So like, okay, I come back from sum 11, right? Like, right, this is now, we're done, right? And sum was 1, and then we called some digits, and then it was supposed to return us 2, right? However, we don't actually capture that 2 anywhere, right? So what we get is just 1. We don't capture the 2 and we don't add it to sum. So what we do is just we return 1. Even though we did this recursively correctly, however, we're not capturing that sum.
Yep, got it. Makes sense.
Yeah, whenever you're returning things and you're like concatenating things together or adding things like into a total, you always have to make sure it's plus equals the recursive call, always. And you always have to make sure you're returning something in the function itself. You have to return in 2 places, once in the base case and also once at the actual end of the function. Because the base case will only be hit 1 time. Every other, like let's say this was like a big number, every single time, this is going to be called what, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 times, right? Only the 11th time will we hit it here, okay? Every other time it's going to hit here, That's another way to think about it, if you want to think about it that way. Yeah. Any other questions on some digits? Okay. So now we are going to do, what are we doing? We're going to do is palindrome. So is palindrome is a little bit tricky, right? So we do const is palindrome, and that's going to be equal to a function. And what this is going to take in is, it's going to take in 1 string. And we are going to return true or false based off of if the string is a palindrome or not. So right away, I want to make sure that I want to ignore case, right? So I could just say string is going to be equal to string dot to lowercase, just to make things simple. Because if the first letter is capitalized and the last letter isn't, but they're still the same, we still want it to, it's still a palindrome, right? So right away, we're going to reset what string is. Now, what we can actually do is we have to think of our base case, right? So if we were to do this looping, wouldn't we check the first letter against the last letter? And if they're not the same, then we can just stop and return false, right? But if they are the same, don't we have to get rid of the first letter and get rid of the last letter and then check the next two? Isn't that what we do? And we'll go down and down and down. So when do we stop? When do we know if it's a palindrome or not? There's actually two different base cases, right? Depending on the length of the string. So if the string is odd, then when we hit one character, that one character in the middle, then we know that it's a palindrome. And then if we have an even length, if there's two, we have to check to see if they're the same. If they're not the same, then it's not a palindrome. But if they are the same, there's nothing else there, so boom, we're good, right? So the first thing we can do is we can write our base case, like if string dot length, if string dot length is equal to 1, we can return true, right? And then our second base case would be if string dot length is equal to 2, we can return string at 0 equals string at 1. This will return true if they're the same, or it will return false if it's not, okay? So now we have handled our base case. So what do we do now, right? What do we do now? We have to check the first letter and the last letter, okay? No matter what. Because if we've made it past here, we know that the string is longer than 2 or 1 characters, right? So we could say if string at 0 is not equal to string at string dot length minus 1, because string dot length minus 1 would be the last character, right? If these are not equal, we can just return false, right? Because right away, like normally, if they're not equal, we can just return false. This is wrong. We don't have to call anything again, right? However, if that's not true, if that's not the case, then we do our recursive slice, our recursing thing, right? We can just return is palindrome, and then we could do string dot slice of 1 to negative 1. Okay? So if we console.log is palindrome, and we can pass in race car, right? We could get true. But if we had an E at the end, race care, we get false. Okay? Dad with a capital D, we get true. Dad with 2 Ds, we get false, right? So when we hit that recursive case, we're returning it, right? Because we're not actually like concatenating anything together here, right? We're just checking something if this is true or not, but we have to do multiple checks. So all of these times, like, okay, we'll return true if it's 1, we'll return this is equal to this if it's 2. Then if it's not, we just check the first letter and the last letter. If they're not the same, we return false. Otherwise, we have to keep checking, right? So then, like, if we passed in race car, right? We would pass in now ace, right? Because we got rid of the 2 R's. So now we pass in that to string, we check this again, we check the first, last letter, and then we return whatever it is. So when we get all the way down, I forgot to see over here. And when we get all the way down to that E, this is finally going to return true, because this returns true. And that true will be passed up all the way to all these return statements that we're waiting, right? Because we finally got it, and it's being passed all the way up to that initial call with race car, and we'll return true. Whereas if we ever hit a false along the way, that will be passed up instead of this. Any questions on is palindrome? This is a little confusing because of the true-false thing, but it makes sense, right? Any questions? Okay. So now we are going to do our recursion 2. And this is going to be no new stuff, okay? We're just going to solve like a different problem, different type of problem using recursion, okay? So we're going to be talking about two things, multi-dimensional arrays and multi-dimensional objects, okay? So let's say I have, I wanted you to write a function that given like, given an array with like A, B, and then an array inside C, D. Let's say I wanted to return a single string of A, B, C, D, right? So thinking about this, we can just loop through this array, check to see if something's an array, and if it is, loop through that inner array. Otherwise, we just add it to our result string. And in that inner loop, through each character, we'll add it to that result string as well. But what if there was an array inside here? Like, what if you didn't know, right? Well, you can kind of finagle your way into doing like a while loop kind of thing, but this would actually be a lot simpler to solve recursively. So let's say I have a function concat else elements, and that's going to be equal to a function, right? And that's going to take an array. So what do we do, right? What do we do? So what is our base case going to be? So this is a little confusing, right? So tackling multi-dimensional arrays and multi-dimensional objects is actually a little different. So because you do start these problems like the same way that you would if you were doing loops, right? So the first thing that I will do is let results equal to a string, and then I'll leave that here. And then I'm going to do a for loop, right? Let I equal 0, I is less than array.length, I plus plus. Bullshit. I, oh my god, I plus plus. Okay? Now, because we have to loop through this array, like we just have to loop through it. Okay? So now our base case is actually going to be whether or not an element is an array or not, okay? So we can kind of say like an if statement, like if array dot is array, and then we'll pass in array of I, right? We'll do some stuff. Else, if it's not an array, we'll say result plus equals, result will plus equals array of I. Because we know that it's not going to be an array, so we can just add it into our string, right? So inside of this if statement, we still have to add something to result. Just like before, when Kate asked me about like, oh, I think I was just I just wasn't adding to sum, right? Likewise, we still have to add to result here. But what are we actually adding to the result? What we are doing is we're adding concat else invoked with array of I. We're passing in array of I because we know that it's an array. Because we know that because we we are in that if statement, right? We did array.isArray and we passed an array of I, so now we do result plus equals concat else of array of I. Then, once we actually make it out of our for loop, we will return result. Okay? And that is all she wrote about that. So, let me do this. Let me walk through this with a little representation of the call stack. Okay? Because this is really going to help you understand. And we'll run through this example. Okay? Just to show you that this works, we'll just console.log concat else, and we'll pass in the string array. And we get ABCD. Okay? And we'll do like type of, it's a string. Okay? So what happens when we call that? What happens when we do that? So the first thing that happens is concat else goes on the call stack, and we invoke it with this array. Okay? So now, let's take a look at what result looks like, right? So result looks like an empty string right now, right? So let's go through this function and see what happens. We are looping through array if array.isArray of array of I. Is that an array? No, that is just the letter A. So we'll skip this if statement, go into the else, and then result will be A, correct? So we'll continue our loop, and then we'll say if array.isArray of array of I. I is now 1, so we're looking at B. That is not an array, so we will skip the if, go into the else, and we'll say result plus equals array of I. So now we have AB. That is what result is so far for this function. Now we get to our next element. And what is our next element? It is this whole array. That is one element, this whole array. So we say if array.isArray of array of I. Yes, we have finally hit it. So now this result is going to be plus equal to concat else, and then we're going to pass in C, and then this array of D, okay? So now this function has to be paused. This function has to be paused, right? So now we go onto the call stack again, and we put concat else, and then we pass in C and D. So this whole thing is paused, so let's see what result looks like, right? So first off, it starts out as an empty string, and then we do this for loop, and we say if array.isArray of array of I. What is array of I? It's a C. That's not an array. So we'll skip over that if and go directly into the else, and we'll just add that C into our result string. So now we'll go to our next iteration, I is now 1, if array.isArray of array of I. Yes, that is an array. That is an array with one thing inside. So that is going to be, the final the result string is going to be plus equal to concat else, and we're going to pass in that array with just D. Okay? So now this thing is paused. So we will go over here and we will call concat else with the array of D. So now we loop through this array. Is array of I an array? No, it is just a letter. So we skip the if and go into the else. So now result was an empty string, and now it's just D. Okay? And then our for loop has finished, right? There was just one thing in here, so it just ran one time, right? So now this returns D. If this returns D, wasn't this iteration waiting for the C plus equals concat else of D? Well, this just finished running, and what we got was D. So this isn't paused anymore, because we get our result, and that's going to be D. So really, now over here, result is D, CD. And since we were just waiting in that time in that piece of time to see what this was, we skip over that else, and that was the last element in that array. So we can break out of the for loop in this universe, right? And then we can return result, which is CD. So now that we return result CD, we can take that off of the call stack. Now this is no longer paused, and concat Ls of C and CD, this returns CD. So now, this whole time, we were waiting for AB plus equals concat Ls of that thing, right? But we know that this returns CD, so really, line 39 would be AB plus equals CD. So that's just ABCD, right? Now, we skip over that else, and remember, we were on this array, and that was the last element. So we break out of that for loop, and we return ABCD. And now since that's done, we take it off the call stack. Any questions? Okay. I will put back this call stack over here. Just so for your notes, I'm comment this out. And we'll start the slides, okay? So look at this example. So logs an array, right? So we have logs an array that loops through the array and it logs out every single element, right? So what if the input is nested? Consider element on line 3. That could be a number or it could be another array, right? So if an element is an array, we want to log every number inside of it. If only we had a function that takes an array and logs out all of its values. Oh, wait a second. We just did that, right? So what we see in the console here would just be 1 and then an array 2, 3. So instead of that, what if we check to see if that thing was an array, and then we would call logs an array again. So let's see what happens on the call stack over here, right? So we call logs an array with 1 and with an array with 2 things in it, right? The number 1 and then an array with 2 things in it as well, the numbers 2 and 3. So this goes onto the call stack, right? And then we call logs an array with 1, 2, 3. And then what happens is for let I equal 0, I is less than array.length. So we'll loop through this array. We'll pull out that array of 1, array of I, and store it in element. Then we check to see if that current element is an array. The current element is not an array, so I mean there should be a 1 over here. It's because we would just go into this else and we would log that element. Then we go to our next iteration of the loop, which would be the 2, 3. So then we say if array.isArray of element, which it is, we call logs an array again of 2, 3, right? So yeah, there's the 1 there. So, and then we get the 2 and the 3, because now over here, we're just looping through this one array with just the numbers 2 and 3 on it, right? And that never hits this if statement, that always hits that else statement. So we see the 2, 3 in the terminal. Then we could finally take logs an array off the call stack, and then this logs an array can come off the call stack as well. Any questions on why this is working?
Can you just quickly go over line 6?
So when we hit line 6, what is element?
It's whatever is in the array.
Yeah, but line 6 will run specifically if element is a certain type, right?
Oh, okay.
Like, line 6 will only run if element is an array.
Okay.
So when we call line 6, we know that element is an array. And what is line 6 doing? It's calling logs an array again, but passing in that inner array. So that's what happens over here. Then we put something else on the call stack, which is logs an array of 2 and 3. And now, as you can see, the array that's being passed into logs_array does not have any inner arrays inside of it. So we will loop through that array, and we will never hit this if statement, right? Because array.isArray will always return false. So then, exactly, right? So now we'll just log out the 2 and 3, and then we'll return nothing from here. And then, everything's good and dandy. But if there was another inner array, we would hit this if condition, and then another call would be on the call stack, right?
I get it. Thanks.
For sure. Any other questions? All right. So let's just run through that concat_else example again. So we're gonna take a function that's going to take an array and then concatenate every single string that's inside of there into one string at the end and return that at the end. Okay? So here's the function, right? So, and here is a little diagram that will show you what the final string will look like. So once again, I just did this with you, so I won't spend too much time on it, but let's go through it again because, it's good practice. So when we call concat_else with an array of A and then another array inside of it, final string is initialized as an empty string, right? So we loop through that array, we pull out that element into array of I, and we check to see if array.isArray of that element. And what is that current element? It's just the letter A. So this is not true. So we will go into that else statement and add A to the final string. So now final string is A, right? So now we will go to that next iteration, and that next iteration element would be array of 1, which is this array BC. So line 5 is now true. This element is an array. So what do we do if we go into this if statement? We do final string, which is currently an A, and we're going to plus equals concat_else, and we're going to pass in BC, right? So this function has to be paused because we have to see what concat_else of BC returns so we can add it into the A. So concat_else of BC goes on to the call stack while concat_else of ABC is paused. So when we run concat_else of BC, the final string is an empty string, right? And then when we loop through here, we check to see if element of array of I, which is a B, is an array. It is not, so we go into the else statement and we do final string, which was an empty string, plus equals B, so we get that B. Then we increment I, and then I is now 1, and then inside of that array at index 1, we have that letter C. So we check to see if that element is an array. It is not, it is just the string C. So we go into this else statement and we do final string, which is this letter B, now plus equals this letter C, which would then be BC. Now, we are done, right? That was the second iteration, and there was only 2 things in this array. So we break out of that for loop, and then concat_else of BC returns BC, right? So if this returns BC, that means this is finished running because it returned a value. And if it returned a value, what was waiting for that to return a value? Over here. So A is now, we were all this time, we were waiting for final string, which was just the letter A, to be concatenated with whatever that function returned, which is BC. So now it's concatenated with ABC. So we skip over that else statement, and then we reach the bottom of the loop. And since this was the last element, this array was the last element in that inner array was the last element of that outer array, then we can break out of the loop and we can return ABC. So then we could take that off of the call stack, and that's that. We get ABC. Any questions? Cool. This is literally the example I showed you before. Yeah. So then we get ABC. So now we'll talk about nested objects. Working with nested objects is very, very similar to working with nested arrays. It's literally the same thing, right? So we use except like with arrays, we use for loops and we do the array.isArray, right? That's not what we do with objects. We use a for in loop to iterate through the object. And if the value is another object, we can recursively call the function on that nested object. So we'll do this example with SumVals quickly, and we'll write a function, SumVals, that sums the values in an object. So over here, as you can see, if we pass in an object with the key A and the value 10, and then the key B and the value 20, what this function is doing is it's declaring a sum and setting it to 0. Then we do a foreign loop through that object, let key in obj, and then we say sum is now going to be plus equal to obj at key, right? So then we'll do that for every key value pair, and then we'll return sum. So obviously we get 30. However, what if we're passing in a gigantically nested object, right? We have to use recursion because we don't really know how nested this object could be. So let's look at the call stack once more, right? So like always, we're going to, like before, we're going to declare a sum variable and we're going to set it equal to 0. And some vals, like as you can see, this whole thing is on the call stack. So we're going to loop through this object and we're going to first pull out object at key and set it to value. Object at key right now, key, let's say, is A, right? So object at A is 1. So if the type of value is an object, it's not, it's a number. So we go into this else statement and we'll just say sum plus equals 1, right? So sum is now 1. Then we go into our next iteration of our for in loop, and then we get to the key B. So when we pull out object at B, we get a giant object. So value is this giant object. So if type of value is an object, it is, sum is now going to be plus equals to some values of that giant object, right? So then we have to put that on the call stack as well. And now this whole thing is paused, right? So some values of C, D, E2, F3, right? So right away, we initiate the sum to 0. I'm sorry that's hidden right now, but there's a lot on the screen. So the sum is 0. And then we do a for in loop through this object. So first we say let value equals object at key. And the key is C, so object at C would be this other object. Is the type of value of that an object? It is. So then we're going to say 0 is going to be plus equals to some vals, and then that object with D inside, right? So wait a second, we have another function call over here. So we have to pause this function and put this function on this other function on the call stack over here, right? So now we can once again declare sum to 0 and we'll loop through the object that was passed in. So we can say for let key in obj, and then we could say let value equal object at key. Let's say key was D, so the value would be this object. Is value an object? Is the type of that value an object? It is. So we'll say that 0, which is sum, is now going to be plus equals to some vals of that object E2 F3, right? Bear with me. I know this is a lot. But now, since we have another function call, this function has to be put on pause, and we can throw this function on the call stack. So we initiate sum at 0, we loop through this object, let's say the key is E, so value would be the number 2. Is the type of value of this an object? No, it is a number. So we will go into this else statement, we will not run our recursive call, and we will say sum plus equals 2. So 0 plus equals 2, so sum is now 2. We will go to our next iteration of our for in loop, and the key is now F. So then the value would be 3, right? So if the type of that value is an object, it's not, it's a number. So we will skip over line 6. We will not run our recursive call. We go into our else statement, and then on line 8, we do sum, which is 2, is now going to be plus equals to value, which is 3. So now our sum is 5. Now, that was the last key value pair, right? We just did that. So we break out of that for in loop and we return sum, which is 5. So now that we returned 5, this whole time over here, we were waiting for this to evaluate. And this just evaluated to 5, right? So we could take that off the call stack and then we would replace the 5, that function call over here, with this 5. And then we were waiting to add that sum, which was 0, to whatever that thing returned. So 0 plus equals 5, the sum is 5. Now, since there's only one key value pair over here, it looped once, and now it returns sum, which is 5. So now that this returns 5, we can take this off of the call stack, and this can be evaluated to 5. because it finished running. So now we got our return value, and it's a 5, right? And now this whole time we were paused on line 6, right? And the sum in that point of time was 0, and we were just waiting to see what we would be adding to that 0, which now we know is a 5. So we can add that 5. And now, like before, like that function before, this object, C, is one key, and its one value is this object. And that's the only key value pair. So we can finally break out of this for in loop, and then hit line 11 and return 5. So now that this returns 5, we could take this off of the call stack, and this whole time, we were waiting for this to see what it would return so we can add it to that 1. So now we do 1 plus equals 5, we get 6, and since that was the last key value pair in this giant object, we can break out of the for in loop and return 6. Take that off of the call stack, and we get 6. Any questions on that? This is literally the same, right? This is the same as the concat elements. Instead of saying array.isArray, we check to see if the type of that value is an object, right? It's literally the same thing.
I got like one question.
Yeah.
Question. This is for line 3. It's the first time I'm seeing a for loop within that form. Do we have to? Are there like other ways of writing for loops similar to this one, or it's just?
You haven't seen a for in loop?
No, I see the for loop. I never seen it within that format.
But this is not a for loop. This is a for in loop.
Oh, for in. Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Robin talked about this when you guys covered objects, and probably also object methods. I don't know if you were in attendance for that, but yeah, this is how you loop through an object.
Okay.
Okay. So just a little like refresher for everybody for in loops. So So for in loops, you obviously do the for keyword again, but instead of like let I equal 0, I is less than this, whatever, we don't need numbers, right? Because objects don't have indexes, okay? They're key value pairs. So what for in loops do is you define a variable. We usually call it key, but you could call it whatever you want, which will store the key for every iteration. So if we have the key in this specific object, we can pull out the value, right? And this is this format of how you do it. For let key in the object you're looping through. Okay? If you're still struggling, if not still struggling, but like maybe if you missed a class or something like that, I don't really know. But definitely go back and do the objects workshop and watch Robin's lecture on that, because he'll definitely like get more into detail on that. Okay? For sure. And it's just different, it's not hard. So don't be like nervous about it or anything like that. But as you can see here, that this is still the same format pretty much as the concat else. And the main takeaway I want you guys to like really think about this is the base case. So the base case in these problems, we did not do first, and the base case this time is like in the else. It's kind of reversed, right? We do if, like usually we would do like if string.length is 0, if the number is 0, if the array.length is 0, then we return and we do nothing. However, this time in our if statement, we're checking if array.isArray returns true. If the type of value is an object, then we can do our recursive call. Else, we just add it, right? Else we just add, okay? So that's like the main like mental difference when you're doing the problems, okay? Any other questions? That's all. So if there's no other questions, we can get back into I'll assign pairs and stuff and breakout rooms, and you guys can go into your workshops. Does that sound cool? Okay.